It wasn't supposed to be seen by anyone outside that room, a brief, unguarded exchange caught between takes, where the cameras were technically off but something far more revealing slipped through. No script, no direction, no polished smiles, just a moment that felt too real to be part of any performance. And when that fragment quietly surfaced among a small group of insiders, it triggered a question no one had dared to ask out loud before. Because if that moment was genuine, then everything the public had believed about Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson might have been only part of a much more complicated truth. For years, the dynamic had been carefully defined. Professional, respectful, occasionally playful, but always within a boundary that felt safe for public consumption. They were co-stars who shared undeniable chemistry on screen, yet consistently reinforced the narrative that everything beyond that was purely fictional. Interviews followed a familiar rhythm, with light jokes, controlled answers, and just enough charm to keep audiences engaged without revealing anything too personal. But beneath that polished surface, there were moments that didn't quite fit the script. Subtle shifts in body language, pauses that lingered a second too long, glances that seemed to carry meaning beyond the context of the conversation. At first, these details were easy to dismiss, the kind of things fans tend to overanalyze when they become emotionally invested in on-screen relationships. Yet over time, those small inconsistencies began to form a pattern that was harder to ignore. People who had worked behind the scenes started to hint, never directly, never on record, that the connection between them was more complex than it appeared. Not necessarily scandalous, not something easily defined, but something that blurred the line between performance and reality in a way that made even seasoned crew members take notice. It wasn't about dramatic confrontations or obvious boundaries being crossed, but about a kind of tension that lingered quietly in the background. Then came the detail that shifted everything. A fragment of footage, reportedly from a moment when they believed no one was paying attention, began circulating in private circles before slowly reaching a wider audience. It didn't show anything explicitly controversial, yet it carried an emotional weight that felt impossible to fake. The way they interacted, the tone, the hesitation, the almost unspoken understanding, suggested something deeper than what had ever been acknowledged publicly. Fans were quick to react, but not in a unified way. Some immediately embraced the idea that what they were seeing confirmed long-held suspicions about a hidden connection. Others pushed back, arguing that actors are trained to create authenticity even when the cameras aren't rolling, and that reading too much into a single moment was dangerous. But the conversation didn't fade, it intensified, fueled by the growing number of people revisiting old interviews and clips with a new perspective. What made it even more compelling was how consistent the narrative had been before this. There were no major scandals, no explosive rumors that forced a response, no visible cracks in the image both had maintained so carefully. It created a sense of contrast that made this new development feel even more significant. Because when everything appears perfectly controlled for so long, even the smallest disruption can feel like a revelation. There were also whispers about certain decisions made during filming, scenes that were adjusted, interactions that were reportedly reworked, moments that were intentionally kept away from the standard press narrative. At the time, these choices were framed as creative direction or professional boundaries. Now, however, some began to question whether they were part of a larger effort to keep something from becoming visible. As the discussion spread, the line between speculation and belief started to blur. Viewers who once saw their performances as purely fictional began to question how much of what they witnessed on screen was influenced by something real. It didn't necessarily point to a clear answer, but it introduced a level of uncertainty that hadn't existed before. And once that uncertainty takes hold, it becomes difficult to return to a simpler explanation. Still, neither Jamie Dornan nor Dakota Johnson had addressed the situation directly. No confirmation, no denial, just the same composed presence they had always presented to the public. Yet now, that silence carried a different meaning. It was no longer just privacy. It felt like a deliberate choice in the face of a narrative that was beginning to evolve beyond their control. And as more people began to pay attention, one thing became increasingly clear. This wasn't just about a single moment or a single rumor. It was about the possibility that behind one of Hollywood's most talked about on-screen pairings, there existed a story that had never been fully told, and might never have been meant to be. The shift didn't happen with a headline or a scandalous reveal. It happened in the way people started watching him differently. Every old interview suddenly felt like a puzzle, every shared laugh a detail worth dissecting, every pause a potential clue. What once seemed natural now carried a strange tension, as if something had always been there, just hidden in plain sight. And the more people looked, the harder it became to believe that everything had been exactly as it appeared. The online conversation quickly evolved from curiosity into obsession. Entire threads were dedicated to analyzing their interactions frame by frame, comparing early press tours to later appearances, noting subtle changes in tone and distance. Some pointed out how the dynamic seemed to shift over time. Moments that once felt spontaneous now appeared more controlled, more guarded, as if an invisible line had been drawn and both of them were careful not to cross it. Then came the moment that intensified everything. During a public appearance that was meant to promote an entirely different project, Dakota Johnson responded to a seemingly harmless question in a way that caught people off guard. Her answer was brief, almost dismissive on the surface, but there was a flicker of something underneath, a hesitation that didn't match her usual composure. She quickly redirected the conversation, but for those paying close attention, it was enough to spark a new wave of speculation. Not long after, Jamie Dornan faced a similar situation. When asked about his past collaborations, he gave a response that felt carefully constructed, emphasizing professionalism and respect while avoiding anything that could be interpreted as personal. It was the kind of answer that should have settled the conversation, yet it had the opposite effect. Because instead of closing the door, it felt like he was choosing his words with a level of precision that suggested there was more he wasn't saying. That's when the narrative began to split in a more dramatic way. One side saw two professionals protecting their boundaries in an industry that constantly tries to blur them. The other saw something far more complicated, a connection that may have existed beyond what was ever acknowledged, one that required careful management to prevent it from becoming public knowledge. And between those two interpretations, the truth seemed to drift further out of reach. What made the situation even more unsettling was how it started to reshape the way audiences viewed the past work. Scenes that once felt purely scripted now carried an unexpected intensity, as if there was an undercurrent that hadn't been fully understood at the time. It didn't necessarily change what was shown on screen, but it changed how people experienced it, adding a layer of ambiguity that made everything feel more real, and at the same time, more uncertain. There were also quiet claims from individuals who had been close to the production, suggesting that certain moments between them had required adjustments behind the scenes. Nothing confirmed, nothing officially documented, but enough to keep the conversation alive. These weren't explosive accusations, but rather fragments of insight that hinted at a dynamic more complex than the public narrative allowed. And sometimes, those fragments can be more powerful than any direct statement. Yet despite all the noise, there was still no definitive answer. No clear confirmation that anything had crossed a line, no undeniable proof that there was more than what had been presented. Just a series of moments, reactions, and carefully chosen words that left room for interpretation. And perhaps that ambiguity is exactly what keeps the story alive, the sense that there is something just beyond reach, something that almost reveals itself but never fully does. In the end, the most striking change isn't what has been proven.